Moderator and panelist for session 1 titled Strategic Implications of the War in Ukraine for Regional Security in Southeast Asia. Moderating this session is Ms. Lee Soo-Ann, Senior Fellow and Coordinator of the Regional Strategic and Political Studies Program at ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. Ms. Lee also happens to be the coordinator of this year's Regional Outlook Forum. The panelists for the session are Professor Woo Sin Po, Professor Raja Mohan, Dr. Ashley Tellis, and Dr. Nguyen Hong Son. Without further ado, I will now hand the time over to Ms. Lee Soo-Ann, please.
Thank you, Afra. Good morning, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first session, panel session, focusing on the strategic implications of the war in Ukraine on Southeast Asia. Come February, the war in Ukraine would have reached its one-year mark. Apart from the chaos it has wreaked on the humanitarian front and on the global food and energy supplies, it has served as yet another polarizing issue in the ongoing big power rivalries between the US and Russia, and of course, between the US and China. The web of interdependencies many countries have with Russia on the one hand, and the US and Ukraine on the other, be they in terms of energy supplies, wheat and grain supplies, military equipment, security cooperation, and the like, have created strategic dilemmas for many countries, as they can't, or prefer not to, afford to alienate either side due to the vital economic and security interests at stake. And as everyone would know, the ongoing war in Ukraine is taking place against the backdrop of intensifying US-China rivalry that has bled into various key sectors, from the technology sector and to critical supply chains. The tightening relationship between Russia and China adds to further complexity to the strategic chessboard, both for the US and Western countries and other countries in the region. All of this increases the stakes and narrows the strategic options. Various commentators, including Harvard professor Graham Allison, the author of the book Destined for War, Can America and China Escape the Thucydides Trap, which was written just five years ago, but actually quite prescient, has drawn parallels between the power dynamics we're seeing today and to the circumstances just prior to World War I, in which an interlocking web of alliances dragged the major powers into war. With us this morning to help us think through these complexities are four very prominent and distinguished speakers, each representing respective views from the US, China, India, and Vietnam. First to speak this morning will be Dr. Ashley Tellis. He is Tata Chair for Strategic Affairs and Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in the US. Next, joining us virtually from China is Professor Woo Sin Po, who is Dean of the Institute of International Studies and the Director of the Center for American Studies at Fudan University. Morning, Prof. Woo. Welcome virtually. We have also with us Prof. C. Raja Mohan, who was formerly the director of the Institute for South Asian Studies here in Singapore, but now a senior fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute in New Delhi. And last but not least, providing a perspective from Vietnam and Southeast Asia is Dr. Nguyen Hong Son, who is Vice President of the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam and Director General of the ISEAS Institute. In the interest of time, I won't be reading their full bios, and you can read them and the abstracts of their presentations on the ROF Digital Conference Guide, which has been made available to you. Each of our speakers will speak for about 10 minutes before we open the floor to Q&As. And can I just prime the audience to say that we can probably expect some contrasting and alternative perspectives from what you heard this morning. So on that note, may I please hand the podium over to Dr. Tellis, please.
Thank you. Well, let me start by thanking ISEAS for inviting me to participate in this forum. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to returned to Singapore after many years, including the terrible interlude brought on by COVID-19. I want to make 4 points this morning in the interest of time. And these points are offered, as Sue-Ann pointed out, from an American perspective. But I do want to emphasize that this perspective is only one American perspective among many. For those of you who have followed American politics in recent years, it is impossible to claim for any one single person to offer a definitive American perspective. So treat that for whatever it's worth. In any event, the first point I think that needs to be emphasized is that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been simply calamitous for global order and for European security. On this, there is widespread agreement. What is less clear, though, is the extent of the US commitment to resisting this invasion and the reasons for the US to resist this invasion. And I want to make the point that the US has a vested interest in ensuring that this Russian aggression is defeated. And the US commitment to defeating this aggression should not be doubted for at least 2 reasons. The first reason is demonstrative and is actually anchored in developments far away from the European mainland. It's focused on China and the Indo-Pacific. It is in American interest to let China appreciate that any similar behavior in the Indo-Pacific will also come to a sorry end. And therefore, making sure that the Russian aggression in Ukraine has an appreciation, the consequences are understood way beyond the European continent, is critical for American interests. There's also a strategic reason that goes beyond the demonstrative. And the strategic reason is that defeating Russia and Ukraine actually frees the United States to focus more concertedly on the Indo-Pacific because it reduces the threat to Europe and minimizes the burdens on the American defense of Europe. And so there is a very simple empirical reality that is going to push the United States to resolutely oppose what China is now doing. Now, in the United States, there is sometimes the view that the US must choose. It must choose between Europe and the Indo-Pacific. I disagree with this view. And I think the present administration in Washington also disagrees with this view. The United States is a superpower, and the United States will pursue its vital interests in both parts of the world, in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific, without sacrificing one to the other. In fact, the real issue going forward, in my judgment, is not the choice between theaters, but rather the choice between strategies. Should the United States accept the risks of a long war of attrition in Europe, or should it double down on aiding the Ukrainians to defeat the Russians in short order? Now, the United States, for fears of escalation, has appeared to be more comfortable with the notion of a war of attrition rather than a quick and decisive Ukrainian victory. But I would argue that that is precisely the choice that this administration ought to reconsider in the weeks and months ahead. Point number 2, a Russian defeat in Ukraine, which is, in my judgment, desirable from the point of view of US interests, will certainly deepen Russian-Chinese ties and will increase Moscow's dependence on Beijing for political and strategic support in the years to come. It will lead to increased Russian-Chinese military technology cooperation in ways that benefit China. And it will deepen a solidified opposition to the West, despite the persisting asymmetry in Russian and Chinese capabilities. These are obviously unfortunate consequences, but these are consequences that we will simply have to live with, because the reality is that even if Putin departs the scene in Russia, Putinism as a worldview, that is a worldview which believes in the existential struggle between a Russian civilization and the West, makes the imperative of defeating Russia decisively all the more important. In other words, the United States does not have a choice. It will have to run the risks of a closer Russian-Chinese alignment and cope with the consequences of that risk by making certain that one partner in that alignment is severely weakened in the years to come. My third point is that as the United States pushes back against Russian aggression, it will only intensify US-China competition. And the effects of that intensification will be seen not just in the Indo-Pacific, but globally. This US-China competition, however, will be a mixed-sum game, not a zero-sum game of the kind that we saw during the Cold War. Conflict and cooperation will be intermixed, but with one important difference. Cooperation going forward will be embedded in competition rather than competition being embedded in cooperation, as was the case during the last 30 years. There are going to be 7 dimensions of this competition which are going to implicate Southeast Asia and the globe more generally. The first is the competitive effort that both sides will make with respect to building alliances and breaking alliances. Second, the quest for technological superiority. Third, the quest to erect upon an open trading system a layer of strategic trade. Fourth, a persistent and open-ended struggle over future technical standards. Fifth, the struggle to control international institutions in ways that advance the national interests of each side. Sixth, an ideological rivalry between the United States and China that simply cannot be wished away. And last, and perhaps very importantly, the struggle for military access to Asia, which will motivate American strategic planning for the next decade to come. I make this point only to emphasize that this competition going forward is going to be multidimensional. It's going to implicate many players around the world, and it is not going to be a competition that is going to be easy to mitigate, despite the best interests and the best intentions in both capitals. My fourth and last point. Southeast Asia will be caught in this crossfire because it is geopolitically central to emerging US-China competition in a way that it was not during the Cold War. The region, however, has agency, but its agency will be displayed more with respect to how it maneuvers within the framework of the competition. But in my judgment, neither the region nor regional institutions will be able to define or alter the fundamental structure of the larger rivalry. In this context, it's very important to keep one single point in mind. The United States is not in the business of forcing the region to choose. The United States is in the business of protecting its primacy and preventing China from dominating the region. This contestation will force countries to make certain choices. Those choices will be forced on countries not because of US policies, but because the structure of the rivalry, which is very deep-rooted, and which, as I pointed out, is going to be multifaceted and enduring. In this context, I'm skeptical that regional institutions can actually transform this rivalry in a more peaceful course. The United States will continue to pay lip service to the notion of ASEAN centrality. But no one is counting on ASEAN centrality to mitigate the worst effects of US-China rivalry, even in Southeast Asia. Which leads me to the last conclusion that I want to emphasize. I think for the sake of peace and stability in the region and elsewhere, the regional states will need to remove the blinkers that sometimes color our approaches to politics. While we all want to see a world which is defined by peace, cooperation, and compromise. The fact of the matter is, in Southeast Asia, there is one country that threatens the interests of the regional state, and there is another country that does not. If the region fails to appreciate this fundamental difference, I think whatever policies that come out of Southeast Asia are policies that will not survive contact with reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tellis. As I had promised, it was a very sobering and very hard-nosed, realist perspective, and obviously a lot of food for thought. And let me just now turn the floor over to Professor Wu for his comments. Professor Wu, welcome to the forum, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sue-Ann. Thanks for the invitation from ISEAS. I hope I was able to join you offline. I miss Singapore a lot. From the Chinese perspective, the Ukraine war is a conflict caused by NATO Eastern Wall expansion, a product of geopolitical rivalry between US and Russia in the latter's neighborhood, and a proxy war between Washington and Moscow. I just noted when Ashley Tellis talked about the Ukraine war, he didn't spend even a sentence talking about the US role in this conflict, how the US behavior in Europe has caused this war, but rather he immediately trying to get China involved in this conflict. So I don't think that is a useful analysis. The outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war, however, did give rise to attention to Sino-US competition in the Indo-Pacific region, particularly on the Taiwan issue. In fact, there exist some similarities between US-Russia rivalry in Ukraine and US-China competition in the Taiwan Strait. First, it occurred against the backdrop of US containment against and suppression of China, as Washington has definitely defined China as America's strategic competitor and the most severe geopolitical challenger. Second, as the United States intensifies geopolitical rivalry with China in the Indo-Pacific, it has embedded Taiwan into its regional strategy. Washington has discovered Taiwan's strategic value as both a geopolitical and also a technological leverage against mainland China. Third, given Taiwan's importance to mainland China, Beijing will do whatever it takes to prevent Taiwan from being permanently separated from the mainland. Needless to say, Taiwan is far more important to China than Ukraine to Russia. If Washington failed to deter Moscow from taking military action in Ukraine, it is far less likely that Washington can successfully deter Beijing from taking actions as it deems necessary on the Taiwan issue. Actually, Tellis just mentioned the US commitment to defeating Russia in Ukraine on the one hand, and continue to pursue its Indo-Pacific strategy targeted on China. However, if we have a long memory, think about the US experience in this region, from the Vietnam War to Iraq War to Afghanistan War, I don't know how we should measure the US commitment to pursue its goal through a military action in Asia. The year of 2022 has witnessed the unfolding of US-China strategy, mainly on two fronts. One is economic, technological decoupling, including the unprecedented crackdown on China's semiconductor industry. To some extent, The Cold War on the technological front between two countries has already started, as the US is trying to maintain its economic and military superiority in its contest with China. The other is geopolitical field, in which the US has intensified its support for Taiwan politically, militarily, and economically, and has dramatically increased its involvement in the Taiwan issue. Today, defense of Taiwan has become the buzzword in Washington's strategic community. The visit by US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan last August casted a heavy blow to Sino-US relations and raised the tension in the Taiwan Strait to a dangerous level. Economic and technological decoupling and geopolitical wrestling have worked to reinforce each other. Economic and tech warfare has driven up the momentum for geopolitical rivalry, while geopolitical contest has led to growing economic and technological decoupling. As the risk of conflict between US and China goes up, the Biden administration stresses on the need to manage strategic competition and maintain the channel of communication between two sides. The Xi-Biden summit meeting held in Bali last November helped improve the atmosphere between two countries, introduced cooperation to some issue areas, and laid out a positive roadmap for the relationship in the near future. Yet, it is quite uncertain how much the consensus reached between two presidents can translate into practice, and how long the effect of their meeting will last. In fact, as the US strategy towards China has been firmly established across the party line, plus the constant impact of US domestic politics on its China policy, bilateral strategic distrust between two countries remains high. The willingness to control risk and manage crisis is low, and technical measures put in place for that purpose are weak. So finally, implications for Southeast Asia. I think there are at least three challenges associated with Sino-US strategic rivalry for Southeast Asia, not just in the security field. First, as the US promotes economic decoupling with China, how will Southeast Asian countries handle their economic ties with China? Today, the US is no longer what it used to be, promoting free trade and open trade, but rather embracing economic nationalism and trade and technology protectionism. And also, if we look at the US behavior in WTO, the US itself is becoming a major destructor to the current international regime. So under this background, how will Southeast Asia manage its economic relations with the US on the one hand and with China on the other? Two, as Washington presses ahead with its Indo-Pacific strategy targeted on China and endeavors to bring Southeast Asia on board, how will Southeast Asian countries deal with US pressure and coax? Will ASEAN countries be able to deal with this challenge in an ASEAN way, or it has no choice, but rather embrace the American way? Third, as Sino-US wrestling on the Taiwan issue heats up and produces broad impact on regional stability, how will Southeast Asia cope with the headache? Is Southeast Asia willing to be involved in a Sino-US security competition, confrontation, and even military conflict on the Taiwan Strait? So that is a big question mark. So with that, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Wu. So, as you would have heard, two very hard-nosed perspectives from the US and China, which leaves Professor Raja to share perspectives on how other countries seeking to maintain some agency will have space to maneuver. Prof. Raja, please.
Thank you for that. Maybe I might be permitted to add another hard-nosed presentation to the discussion that's already taken place. Firstly, I want to begin by thanking ISEAS for inviting me for this very important conversation on the long-term consequences of the war in Ukraine. Second, I also want to state that it's a perspective from India, It's not the perspective. Never been in the government and not likely to be there. So this is really my perspective of what India is looking, how India is looking at the current conflict. I'll make 3 broad points. One, about the systemic consequences of major wars, that all wars produce change. So I want to speak a little bit about how wars change international politics, particularly major wars. Second, I want to say something about India eating from many tables. I don't know how much they're eating from each table, but it's an interesting way Minister York presented that argument. And a third, look at the larger consequences for Asia and the kind of agency that the region might have in dealing with what is fundamentally a new dynamic. Having said that, I don't think this war is a distant war. I think when many of us say we don't want to choose, mainly in the non-Western world, for us, it's an inconvenience we would like to disappear. But the fact is, in a major war like this, you can run, but you can't hide. The immediate consequences on food, fertilizers, energy, finance, all those are already with us. But I think what is going to be consequential is the structural change in the international system that will be produced by this war. If you go back to the Second World War, when many of our nations were born, even the victors will face the consequence of a war. The European powers prevailed against Germany and Japan, but the winners had to abandon their colonies in Southeast Asia and Asia. So therefore, wars produce outcomes, structural outcomes that everyone has to deal with. Therefore, for us, is to understand those consequences rather than merely hoping that this will just stay away from us. I would say the first point that we need to start with when looking at the consequence of this war is the likelihood of Russia losing this war are high. And I think that must be our starting point. Because I can't see any way in which Russia can come out of this as a winner, whichever way you define victory in this war. So I think Russia is going to be a big loser from this war. And what kind of consequences Russia will face internally, as well as Europe will face, externally, both are going to be of importance. Second, this war has brought the Americans back. So those of us who are hoping that the war will lead to multipolar world, I'm afraid this war is arresting the trend towards a multipolar world that existed before February 24th, 2022. If you see what the US has done, Mr. Macron, the French president, was saying NATO is brain dead. Now NATO seems to be alive. Neutral countries like Sweden and Finland are joining them. You have the third largest economy, Japan, the fourth largest economy, Germany, have been mobilized to simultaneously deal with the challenges from China and Russia. And India, the fifth largest economy, is part of the Quad. So I think if you see what the US is doing, that it is mobilizing its full force to unite Europe against Russia and to create new coalitions in this part of the world to deal with the Chinese challenge. I like the Chinese way of simplifying and presenting formulae very easily. Wang Yi once said about American strategy in Asia, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 5 for Five Eyes, 4 for the Quad, 3 for AUKUS, 2 for US bilateral alliances, and 1, of course, the evil himself, the United States. So, but what is missed out, I think, Wang Yi, is the unexpected development that the 3 Asian leaders went to the NATO summit in Madrid. The Korean president, the Japanese prime minister, and the Australian prime minister, and even the New Zealand prime minister. I think even New Zealand has showed up in Madrid. So this idea that it's a distant war, I think what we're seeing is really US is mobilizing its full range of allies and partners to deal with the simultaneous challenge with Russia and China. And I think this is a fundamentally new situation. And what we're likely to see is not a sustaining of a multipolar world. I'm not saying we're returning to a unipolar moment, but what we're going to see most likely is a strong US with its alliances actually reshaping the international system. Now, many of us don't like it, but we have to deal with it. And I think there is no real alternative given where this war has gone so far. The second point, what I wanted to say is about India's position. For us, I mean, it is many of us wonder why India, which traditionally values sovereignty, territorial integrity, is not speaking up against this war. I think the challenge for India has been that although we face a similar situation, what happened in Ukraine is not different from what's happened in Ladakh, where China has unilaterally sought to alter the territorial disposition. But yet, because of our historic partnership with the Soviet Russia, and before that with the Soviet Union, India is struggling to come to terms with a partner that is critical to cope with the military challenges from China. But if you look at the long-term trend in India, India is doing a slow, very slow pivot away from Soviet Russia to the United States. And I don't think there should be any doubt about it. The greater the challenge from China for India's security, the faster will be Indian pivot towards the United States and the West. I mean, many of you think India is purely non-aligned. I mean, might say, look, what is this guy saying? But if you go back to 1962, faced with the Chinese war, Mr. Nehru went to the United States. And in 71, when US and China got together, India went to the Soviet Union. So it's not that we don't do alliances. The question is the context and circumstance and the kind of threats you face. And I think today, for India, the challenges that we face from China are compelling India to look for partnerships of the kind that it was unwilling to do. And I think the two conflicts with China in 2017 and 2020 have pushed India towards a greater cooperation with the US. So the Russia is a complication. We wish Russians would get along with the West. That would make our task easier. But Putin chose otherwise. He chose to go with China, build an alliance with China without limits, while turning down Biden's request in June 2021 to build a new relationship. But that's a reality, and I think that reality we have to deal with. And my sense is, whatever the outcome from the Ukraine war, that's a paradox for India. If Russia loses, it becomes even a more junior partner to China. If Russia wins, the Sino-Russian alliance will get stronger. Both the outcomes are bad for India. Because we were looking for a multipolar world, and I don't think that is happening. For us, I think, therefore, either case, a China that is likely to come stronger in the near term, for us, I think that challenge, dealing with that challenge remains the principal problem. And my sense is that while we hold on to the Russian relationship, while we buy Russian oil, while we maintain Russian weapon supplies, and I think the structural shift of India in its trade, in its economy, in its defense cooperation over the long term is towards the United States and the West, and I think that's a reality we have to deal with. And finally, I think I would say for the rest of Asia, there is agency, real agency for us. I would take you back to the Cold War between US and Russia. There are some countries, all of us talk the non-aligned language, but some countries chose the United States, depending on the circumstance and threat. Some countries opted out. Some countries played both sides. That is the story of the Cold War. And my sense is Asians are as good at realpolitik as the Europeans are. This notion that we are somehow incapable of realpolitik, I think every experience of Asia over the last 100 years tells us we're as good at geopolitics and realpolitik. And my sense is our language will be moral politic, but our actions will be realpolitik. So I would say, watch this space as Asia adapts, because this war is changing the structure of the international system, both in Europe and in Asia. And I think all of us are going to adapt to it. Some of us quickly, some of us slowly, but I think all of us are going to adopt. So I would say, watch this space to see how Asia plays the realpolitik with some agency in which they can maximize the situation and their circumstances to derive some benefits, because the two contesting powers have a value in denying some space to the rival. And that's one of the reasons my sense is, as the conflict gets deeper between US and China, you're going to see both of them trying to reach out to larger number of countries, individually, collectively, and I think that opens up multiple opportunities. So I would say this is an era in which there's going to be fundamental adjustments that are going to be made, and I said Asia will not lag behind. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Prof. Raja. Very, very clear. Next, let me hand over the podium to Dr. Nguyen, please.
Well, thank you very much, Sue-Ann. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, I'd like to express my gratitude to the Yusof Ishak Institute for inviting me to this very important and interesting forum. I'm going to discuss the strategic implications of the war in Ukraine on Southeast Asia. But the matter of fact is that no other topic has been so divisive within Vietnam and within Southeast Asia itself than this topic. The division in Vietnam is between the Russian-educated and the Western-educated, the IR literate and the IR non-illiterate. And so it's a very topic with very diverse view. And therefore, just like the other speakers, I'm going to just speak my humble Vietnamese opinion on this topic. Now, the first argument I'll make is that Southeast Asia will escape the immediate harsh headway of the war on Ukraine. Growth will continue above global average in Southeast Asia. It will slow next year, this year, but it will still a relatively well performing region. We will even benefit to a certain extent from the war in Ukraine because of the diversions and diversifications from markets like China. Business will appear, at least at the outside, as normal. ASEAN will continue to meet, will continue to issue lengthy statements, and partners of ASEAN will continue to subscribe to the notions of ASEAN centrality, whether lip service or not. There will be no major crisis, I assume, I foresee in the South China Sea and possibly the Taiwan Strait as well. Not because China is restrained or lack options, but because the gray zone option is still the one that currently best serves China's interest, or because the buildups in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait is beyond the conventional domains, such as it has moved to the air, to the space, to the cyberspace, or under the sea, beyond the naked eye of a common Southeast Asia. So, 2023 will continue to be a relatively normal year for Southeast Asia. However, the challenges ahead to Southeast Asia, I argue, will be unprecedented. And it is unprecedented because of the precise reasons which our previous speakers have identified, that the war in Ukraine is gradually eroding the global order or the international structure based on which the ASEAN project was built. Take security, for example. ASEAN was able to flourish because of the stability among the major powers' relations. The relative balance of power and relative stable major powers' relations allowed ASEAN to expand and to focus on its domestic integration and to build its community. Major powers competition gave ASEAN a break for the last 30 years to work on its own integration. However, the period of that is going to cease, and ASEAN will now have to deal with a regional environment completely different from what it used to, especially the ASEAN is used to. ASEAN will have to re-equip itself in order to be able to talk about topics that it has taken for granted for some time. Arms buildup, even nuclear proliferations, technology competitions, arms control. Those are the hard security issues that ASEAN will once again have to be able to talk about in order to be, continue to be relevant and to continue its agencies. Take economic integration or cooperation. The idea or the concept of a single market and production base, which ASEAN Economic Community is built upon, is presided on the notion that regionalization complements globalization, and that inter-economic dependency is a stabilizing and pacifying force for the region. Now that is going to change because the fundamental assumptions that economic interdependency is pacifying is gradually changing. It's also because globalization is seen now as an alternative to globalization in the world where decoupling and strategic autonomy is on the rise. ASEAN used to be a melting pot where it meets and combines all the economic forces of all the powers in the region and produce it and package it and send it all over to the world. But now, the forces of the world is separating all those economic fundamentals, and ASEAN will have to cope with that, and will have to find a new way to strategize itself. Institutions. ASEAN is built on institutions such as the UN Charter, such as international law. Those are at the new stage of development. The UN will continue to face challenges, and the institutions and norms based on the UN Charter will also face critical challenges, and ASEAN will have to live with that. So the conditions that allowed ASEAN to thrive since the end of the Cold War, many of those beyond ASEAN's control would cease to exist. But that doesn't mean that ASEAN's agency needs to cease. ASEAN may continue to have agency if it recognizes that the strategic environment surrounding it has changed and take unprecedented steps in order to adapt to it. First, I think ASEAN will need to think about the unthinkable and be able to evolve certain aspects of the ASEAN way. ASEAN may need to know how to work without a full consensus of its members and to accept unilateralism as an alternative option to multilateralism. ASEAN also needs to be able to have bolder security cooperations with its dialogue partners to offer alternative to the currently dominant yet binary approach that preoccupies global politics. Thirdly, ASEAN will need to re-strategize its economic integration and growth dynamics, and to ensure the security and inclusivity of global supply chains that go through Southeast Asia. A revitalized ASEAN is therefore very critical and is vital in the interest of Southeast Asia. So I'll conclude my remarks here with a note that we have faith on ASEAN. ASEAN still is a very important pillar of Vietnam and of many Southeast Asian countries, but a revitalized ASEAN, an ASEAN that grows and adapts to the new structure of global politics and international relations will be needed in order for it to provide its agency and continue its relevance in a very changing world. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Nguyen, for a very constructive and hopeful set of messages and implications for ASEAN. We have now started our Q&A session. I have tons of questions, but I also believe that the many distinguished guests in the audience are also just raring to go with the questions. So I'm going to open the floor immediately to questions, and I will only jump in if there is a lull in the questions, but I seriously doubt it. It's a very big ballroom, and so if you want the floor, please wave frantically so that I can see you, and please identify yourself, and also tell us who you're addressing the question to. So The floor is open for questions. Can I have the first question, please? Yes, someone at the back, all the way there. Ha, is that you?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you, Suan. My name is Ha. I am from the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. The topic of this session is about the war in Ukraine and the implications for Southeast Asia. And I would like, during the discussion, I think the panelists have addressed many dimensions about the war as well as the geopolitical dynamics around it that involves not only Russia but also the US and China. I would like to go straight to the crux of the matter, which is the war in Ukraine and Russia's military actions in Ukraine, and that is framed by many people as invasion of Ukraine. But I would like to invite your views on this matter. I think there are many ways to frame the reasons that led to the war, but can I invite your views about this question? Is it justifiable for a country to bring your troops to another sovereign state and even annex that country's territories? I just would like to have a very straightforward answer, because I noticed that there are many ways to frame the issue, and the one way to evade a straightforward answer is to try to make it a very complicated matter. Thank you.
Okay, so maybe...
And the question is addressed to all of the panelists.
Okay, all panelists, please, a straightforward answer.
Hello. Simple answer is no.
I think no justification can, be provided to march in your troops into another country, a country that you say is your brother nation, with which you share so much, saying that country has no right to exist. And I think you can't cut this in any other way. So I think it is unacceptable. And I think the implications for Asia from this, we have a lot more territorial disputes in Asia. We have a lot more irrident nationalism. And I think if this is allowed to stand in Europe, the consequences for Asia, we've not debated those, of what might be the consequences for Asia if this invasion, annexation by fake referendums stands. We are going to be the biggest losers in Asia because we have so many disputes.
Prof. Wu first, maybe?
I think the UN Charter answers that question very plainly, and the answer is no. In the case of Russia, though, there is an additional reason, because Russia was a party to several memoranda after the end of the Cold War that guaranteed Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. So it goes beyond just simply a principle of international law. There were bilateral commitments that Russia made in the European context.
Prof. Wu?
Well, I think Russia has some legitimate concerns over the NATO expansion to Ukraine, but the way it deals with it, by taking the military action against Ukraine, is unjustifiable. So that's my personal opinion. This is just like the U.S. invasion of Iraq, right? It can have this kind of concerns and even fake intelligence, but it was just an invasion, right? It's unjustified.
Okay, very clear answers. Next question, please. Anyone from the floor? Yes, please. The gentleman in the middle. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you, Ms. Lee, and good morning, everyone. My name is Emmanuel. I'm from the Philippine Embassy in Singapore. I have a question for Dr. Tallis. Dr. Tallis, you said that one of the reasons why the U.S. is determined to counter the Russian invasion of Ukraine is that it wants to convey a message of deterrence to China. It wants to warn China, so to speak, that if it does anything similar anywhere in the world, it will be met with the same concerted resistance that is now undertaking on behalf of Ukraine. My question is, in the event that Russia, for any reason, actually wins the war in Ukraine, what would the message then be? Would the message be the opposite? Would it tell China that the US and its allies are not really the heavyweight players that they claim to be on the world stage? I'd like to get your views on this, Dr. Tallis. Thank you.
It's a great counterfactual question. And I think the best way to answer this is to make certain that the Russians never get to a point where they win in Ukraine, so that we are put into that awkward position of having to answer your question not in a conference room, but in the actual world of international politics.
Okay. Next question. Yes, please.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for all the panelists. My name is Julia Lau. I work at ISEAS in the Indonesia Studies program. This is addressed to, I guess, anyone who cares to talk about the world order. Looking beyond this year, so Robert Gilpin, a very famous IR scholar, talks about in war and change in world politics, every superpower contains within it seeds of its own destruction. The US, China, India, all have huge domestic issues, and at the same time are competing for global influence. It's open to anyone on the panel to address maybe this question. As you see the world in 5 to 10 years from now, whether or not you think it's still going to be more bipolar, unipolar, or multipolar, what would be each superpower's Achilles heel, and how do you think that will affect the world that they are trying to build? Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. If I may just tag on something to Julia's question, because it relates, and it really is about the deep political divisions and polarization that we see existing in many of these countries who are direct protagonists to the shaping of the world order. And the question is, will challenges on the domestic front distract from external security issues, or will they create a more dangerous situation in which there will be a tendency to augment, externalize the issues, if you will, and rally domestic sentiments and distract? So very similar line to what Julia asked. To any panelists who would care to respond, please.
I think the question that you ask is a very important one, and there is no easy way to untangle the issues relating to polarity. If you look at the international system and try to explain it descriptively, there's no doubt that it is multipolar, because there are so many entities of different size, capabilities, and so on and so forth. But when you rack and stack all these countries, you discover that there are categories of countries in terms of capability. And when you look at the highest aggregation of capabilities, there are only 2 countries that are very different for the others in terms of what the Chinese call comprehensive national power. So a first cut, in terms of providing an answer on the basis of the deep structure of the system, is that the future of international politics is more likely to look bipolar than multipolar. But even that, I would say, is insufficient. Because when you look at the bipolarity more closely, you discover that one is a complete superpower and one is an incomplete superpower. So then the question becomes, what criteria are you going to use to distinguish between the relative capabilities of number 1 and number 2? And depending on the criteria you use, you could make the argument plausibly that we are still in a functionally unipolar system, right? Now, the Chinese obviously want to see the end of that system for reasons that one can very readily appreciate. But the point is, when one looks to the future, what I think is going to be the hardest to realize in the near term, over the next 10 years, is a world of genuine multipolarity, where you have countries that match each other roughly in terms of comprehensive national power.
Actually, Ashley, if I may just press you on that, because actually the question was really about Achilles' heel and domestic issues, and we were speaking about this a bit yesterday. Yeah.
When I think of the two countries, the United States and China, I mean, one can extend the analysis to every country in the basket of the top 10. But when I think of the United States and China, and you, again, try to assess relative weaknesses, the United States has one singular weakness. The Chinese have multiple weaknesses. The biggest weakness of the United States is its domestic cleavages and the consequences of those domestic cleavages, both for mobilizing national power and for America's role in the world. So there is a significant Achilles heel for the United States, but it is domestic. With China, I think the weaknesses are manifold. There is an economic slowdown that is coming for structural reasons beyond COVID-19. There are issues relating to China's capacity to maintain a pace of innovation that will allow it to maintain the kind of world order that it seeks. And lastly, there are very big questions, even about China's military capacity, even though it is expanding in very dramatic ways, whether qualitatively and in terms of operational competence, it will actually match the capabilities of its closest peer, which is the United States. So when I look at China, I'm actually much more sobered by the weaknesses that I see in China than I see in the United States. But the United States has that critical weakness of domestic politics, which is not going to go away.
Okay, I will turn the floor to Prof. Wu later, because I'm sure he has something to respond to what Ashley said. But first, Prof. Raja wanted to say something, and then after that, Prof. Wu. Thanks.
Briefly, I think one weakness and one strength. I mean, if you looked at the 20th Party Congress, 2,000 people dressed in the same suits and same ties, clapping for a new leader, gives you image of absolute strength in a particular state. If you saw Mr. McCarthy took 15 rounds of votes to get elected as speaker in one, it tells you, what's happening in the United States. But I think it's very easy to get misled by the superficial appearances. Finally, what matters is the deep strength of the two states. There, I think, for all its problems, whether you go back last 200 years, the US brings a lot more strengths. The biggest strength that the US has, and what it has shown in this crisis, is the capacity to mobilize allies and partners. We saw China sign an agreement with Russia 3 weeks before the invasion, but the Russian ally doesn't look doing too well, and China doesn't have too many allies. While the US, as I said, number 3 economy, number 4 economy, number 5 economy, number 6 economy, everyone is being rallied. In G7, in NATO, in the Quad, you're mobilizing a large number of influential, powerful partners to deal with the simultaneous threat from Russia and China. And I think that is what is fundamentally evolved, that when we thought the West was going to collapse, what we've seen is actually the consolidation of the West and demonstrating the capacity to simultaneously put pressure on both Russia and China.
Okay. Prof. Wu?
Well, I think the world order has been in a very constant dynamic evolution over the last 2 decades. It's not going to be returning to unipolar world. It's not going to be like a bipolar world, as someone suggested. It's going to be a multipolar or multiplex world order, although the different power centers, they are asymmetric in terms of their power. When we think about the world order, I think the most important thing may not be the power, but capability. The capability of the major players to shape the trend and of the events to influence the behavior of other countries. That is the most important thing in international politics, power aside. So in this regard, I think in the future, the world order will depend more and more on how the regional orders look like in different parts of the world. If we look at Asia, I mean, this is not a unipolar or bipolar world. Japan matters, Southeast Asia matters, South Asia matters. So this is certainly not a unipolar or bipolar world. I think it's going to be more and more the case in the future. Now think about the US role in the world. The US power superiority is declining relatively. But the most important thing for me is not the power itself, but the policy. Because the US has become more and more inward-looking, more protectionist, and more divisive in world politics. I think this is a big challenge to use capability to influence, to shape the trend of events in the world. China, on the other hand, is still in a learning process. I think China is somehow caught between two trends. One is that it still believes in globalization and global cooperation because it has benefited a lot from this trend in the last several decades. On the other hand, confronted with the US strategic competition with China, as well as the de-globalization, China is also thinking about some other options. So that will shape the way China plays its role on the world stage. I will stop here. Thank you.
Prof. Wu, if you don't mind, can I also just press you on maybe the domestic situation in China? And Dr. Tellis said that he saw more points of weakness for China domestically. What is your response to that?
We do have a lot of weakness on the economic, social, political, and other areas. I think we are very much aware of this. And also, in our political culture, you saw on the surface this unanimity, right? But actually, I think the debate on many issues, political, economic, and social issues, they have been very dynamic in the Chinese way, different from the US way. So I think China is still in a process searching for building a modern system and institutions to govern itself. This is going to be a long way to go.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Wu. Prof. Nguyen, you want to say something?
Well, I'd like to caution against the overuse of the notions of the polar in describing the global orders, especially future global orders. We find it very troubling to overemphasize the notions of the polars because it recalls the concept of polars during the Cold War, whereas I mean, in the new contemporary global orders, the so-called polars, has changed a lot, and then the measures to measure the powers has changed, and the emphasis should also be paid to the spokes and not just the hubs, and also the polars completely downplays the roles of multilateralism, of regional institutions, and also of non-state actors, which are increasingly important in the global order. So I'd like to caution against too much emphasis on describing global orders in terms of polarity and polars.
Okay, thank you. We have about 10 minutes left. Yes, sir. Can someone hand him the mic? Over there, the gentleman.
Thank you. I'm Wolfgang Sachsenröder, a multiple retiree. Among others, I'm retired from the Yusof Ishak Institute. My question is concerning the outcome, what you mentioned, of the Ukraine war. I see it as a contestation in terms of weapons development at the expense of the Ukrainians, and a huge bonanza for the weapons industry worldwide. So the outcome I cannot see is what the misnomer of security architecture will be meaning after the end of this war, whoever will be declared a winner. I think it's more an insecurity architecture we are having altogether.
Thank you. Was there a question, sir? Oh, it's a statement? Okay. Could we have the next question? Anyone else? Yes, sir, over there. Yep.
My question is to Dr. Nguyen. My name is Suresh. I'm a student from RSIS. Questions related to non-traditional securities such as food and gas. Strategic implications because of the ongoing war. Due to the prolonged period, do you foresee a degradation of Western models of economic cooperation in Southeast Asia and a rise in socialist models to ensure our own survivability in this region? The basis of the question is on 3 points. First is the Russian clamp on Ukraine's grain export actually forced India to increase its own export grain costs to secure its local food demand while managing export demands. I personally have to start looking at other food sources in order to ensure my survivability. Another point is where Indonesia actually went to secure a gas deal with Russia to ensure its survivability during this prolonged period of conflict. So, if Southeast Asia countries are forced to decouple from existing trade agreements, do we also see that, we can also see that China is increasing its economic cooperation in this region at the same time? So historically, China and Russia are siblings. So while their views on Ukraine may differ, it may be only logical to be concerned that communist influences will creep into Southeast Asia in this period. This is something that Southeast Asia has tried to prevent since the foundation of ASEAN's establishment. So do you foresee, hence the question, do you foresee a degradation of Western models of economic cooperation and socialist models in order to ensure our survivability?
Well, as I said in my earlier presentation, ASEAN will have to re-energize and revitalize its economic integration model. The old model of ASEAN's economic cooperation was based on a melting pot concept where we combine all the economic forces of all the economic linkages with partners that we have, combine them together and take advantage of the labor and land-intensive production factors in Southeast Asia and send it to the world. Now, with new forces trending, which is decoupling between the major powers, reshaping of the supply chains, remodeling of the economic based on the green transformations and digitalizations, I think ASEAN will need to remodel its economic cooperation developments and re-strategize it in order for it to become, again, a vital economic region that is continue to be attractive to all its partners, as it used to be during the 80s and 90s. And now ASEAN has not come up with such a strategy at the moment because obviously out of COVID, every country is for itself and it's for its own economic recovery. But soon ASEAN will have to realize that such a strategy is, while it's helping its national economic development, it's not going to be the best option for the region as a whole. And therefore, I think ASEAN will need to soon come up with a post-COVID and post-Ukraine war strategy for its own.
Thank you very much. Okay, we are fast running out of time. What I will do is I will ask each of the panelists to maybe just take a final 1 minute or so to make any final comments and observations that you may have. So maybe what I'll do is I will start from the other end of the table first and have Dr. Nguyen say 1 minute wrap up, and followed by Prof. Raja, and then Prof. Wu, and then Ashley. Okay.
Well, I think it's very critical for ASEANs to understand and to stop making assumptions about how the world will continue to work. And especially, it will have to recognize the fact that the world has changed, and for that, it will have to indeed relook at itself and re-strategize itself. Now, it can start doing so by maintaining and continue to talk to its very vital partners in order to understand their policies towards ASEAN, where ASEAN fits into their strategies in the region, and adapt accordingly. I don't think that has happened within ASEAN yet, but ASEAN will soon have to recognize that and to really go into substantive talk with its dialogue partners.
So I would just make a couple of points. One, I think in the old days, the Chinese communists and the Russian communists used to talk about correlation of forces. Correlation of forces. I think the Chinese are very sensitive to shifts in power balance. And my sense is I'll be surprised if Chinese don't adapt. With a $15 trillion economy, unlike Putin, who's really up, he's in a bad place. He doesn't have much room to walk back from where he has got himself into. China has a lot more room to adapt and adjust its posture. And I think we're beginning to see some of that in relation to Australia, probably with the US, with Japan. So I think China will make modifications to its strategy to prevent the worst outcomes. So I would see that. I would say, in a sense, the ASEAN too, for them, having a stronger US would provide a balance. This might not be the publicly stated position, but I would say logic would suggest a balance would be good for ASEAN as well. So I would do more attention to what the ASEAN does rather than what it says. I would pay more attention to what they say in public and what they say in private, because no country is going to simply ignore a fundamental shift in the power structure around it. And as I said in the beginning, Asian countries are as good at playing realpolitik as anybody else.
Prof. Wu?
Well, in talking about the outcome and implications of the Ukraine war, we should avoid a short-sighted and even short-sighted view and even wishful thinking, because I think the outcome and the implications will be very complicated. Ukraine will be different. Europe will be different. Russia will be different. Maybe we cannot say a clear winner coming out of the conflict, and major parties involved will be losers to some extent. So let's wait to say what's to happen in 2023.
Thank you. Dr. Tellis.
We had a lengthy conversation this morning, first in the first session and then concluding now in the second. And one of the themes that came across in both was the effort to grapple with change. And Mr. Yo this morning described change in a multiplicity of dimensions. I would argue that all those changes are real. But it's very important to keep in mind, what the French author said in 1849, I think. The more things change, the more they stay the same. That underlying all the changes that we see at the level of superstructure, there are two enduring realities which are not changing and are unlikely to change anytime soon. The first is the fundamental importance of power in terms of shaping outcomes in international politics. It's not ideas, it's not just institutions, it's power. And the most effective agent for the execution of power still remains the state. Now, this has some very important implications for the United States as we think about Asia in the years to come. our tasks as we think about our challenges in Asia are actually not as difficult as is often realized, for a very simple reason. The United States can always count on the self-interest of other states and their desires to remain independent and autonomous. We don't have to force our power on anyone else. There will be dynamics of balancing that will arise naturally in Asia as a result of China's primacy. All we have to do is not be stupid enough to short-circuit those processes. So when I look to the future in Asia, I'm actually very optimistic. As long as we keep our circumstances at home in good repair, the globe will benefit and desires American leadership, and it wants American leadership to be used constructively and purposefully. And so if we can maintain that sense of purpose, avoid doing stupid SHI, I won't utter the last letter, we can actually maintain a global system that serves both the interests of peace and security as well as our own interests.
Thank you very much. So on that note, I think everyone would agree that this has really just been a very, very insightful and thought-provoking session. I want to thank all of the panelists for their time and their insights and speaking candidly. I think we've all gained a lot from it. And so without further ado, can I just ask you to thank our panelists, and we'll draw this session to an end.